Welcome to another story written by Oracle 1. The Shadows That Move of the Haunted Shipwreck. Chapter 1. The Atlantic was calm enough to make Captain Rowan Hale uneasy. He had spent nearly 15 years diving shipwrecks along forgotten stretches of coastline, and experience had taught him that the sea rarely became this still without reason. Waves continued to roll against the cliffs beyond Blackwater Point, but around the rusting wreck lying half-submerged in the fog, the water resembled polished obsidian. Even the gulls circling overhead refused to cross an invisible boundary surrounding the vessel. The ship had no official name anymore. Time and salt had stripped the lettering from her bow decades earlier. Local fishermen simply called her the Widow's Mercy, though old maritime records listed no vessel by that title. According to surviving documents, the wreck had drifted ashore sometime during the winter of 1934 after disappearing in a storm that had never been fully explained. No distress signal had been received. No survivors had been found. Every attempt to tow the ship back out to sea had failed. Tow cables snapped. Engines stalled. Men abandoned the work after claiming they had seen figures walking along the upper deck long after sunset. Rowan had dismissed those stories. Until today, he climbed from the inflatable boat onto the warped remains of the main deck. Wet timber groaned beneath his boots. Rust stained every surface a deep reddish brown, while strips of seaweed clung to shattered railings like drowned hair. Behind him, his only companion remained in the boat. "I still don't like this," Claire called. She was an underwater archaeologist who had reluctantly agreed to accompany Rowan after satellite imagery revealed unusual structural features beneath the wreck. She had spent most of the journey trying to convince him to postpone until morning. "It's barely noon," Rowan answered. "It feels like midnight." She wasn't wrong. The fog surrounding the ship absorbed the daylight until the wreck existed inside its own dim twilight. The cliffs had disappeared entirely. Even the inflatable boat looked strangely distant despite floating only a few meters away. Rowan extended a hand. "You coming?" Claire hesitated before climbing aboard. The instant both of her boots touched the deck, a low metallic groan echoed somewhere deep inside the hull. Neither of them moved. The sound continued for several seconds before fading into silence. "Old ships settle," Rowan said, mostly to reassure himself. Claire looked toward the open cargo hatch. "They usually don't sound like they're breathing." Neither laughed. The entrance to the lower decks yawned before them, surrounded by twisted steel supports coated in decades of corrosion. Darkness filled the opening completely. Rowan switched on his flashlight, its powerful beam disappearing into blackness without reaching the bottom. He frowned. "That should have hit the floor." Claire aimed hers beside his. Both beams vanished. The darkness seemed to swallow light instead of reflecting it. A cold wind drifted upward from below. It carried the smell of seawater mixed with mildew, old engine oil, and something unexpectedly fresh. Wet soil. As though the ship had somehow sailed through a forest instead of an ocean. Rowan adjusted the camera mounted to his helmet. "Let's document everything." Claire nodded without speaking. They descended. The metal staircase creaked beneath every step. Water dripped steadily somewhere below, each drop echoing far longer than seemed possible. Halfway down, Rowan paused. "Listen." Claire remained perfectly still. Nothing. Then, another footstep. Not theirs. One slow step somewhere deeper inside the ship. Then another. Heavy. Measured. Deliberate. Rowan swept his flashlight along the corridor below. Empty. The footsteps stopped. Claire swallowed. "You heard that too?" He nodded. Neither mentioned the obvious. The footsteps had continued after both of them had stopped moving. The lower corridor stretched farther than the ship's exterior dimensions should have allowed. Narrow doors lined both sides, many hanging open from broken hinges. Cabins. Most remained untouched since the wreck. Beds still stood neatly made beneath blankets reduced to gray tatters. Rusted lanterns rested on bedside tables beside cups whose contents had long since become black dust. One cabin contained children's toys scattered across the floor. Another held dozens of shoes, arranged in perfect rows. Every room felt abandoned only moments before someone had intended to return. Claire photographed everything. I don't understand. What? No marine growth. Rowan looked closer. She was right. Although seawater had flooded much of the lower deck over the decades, the interior walls showed remarkably little evidence of barnacles or coral. It looked less like a ship resting in the ocean for 90 years, and more like one preserved somewhere untouched by time. A faint scratching interrupted his thoughts. Scratch, 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 coming from behind the wall beside him. Rowan knocked against the steel. The scratching stopped instantly. Claire stared at him. What made that? He answered honestly. I don't know. They continued deeper. The corridor eventually opened into what had once been a grand dining hall. Long tables remained bolted to the floor. Chairs stood pushed neatly beneath them. Silverware rested beside cracked porcelain plates exactly as though dinner service had been interrupted mid-meal. Only there were no bodies. No skeletons. Nothing. Just silence. Claire crouched beside one of the tables. The dust. Rowan looked. There wasn't any. Instead, every surface appeared freshly wiped. His flashlight beam drifted upward toward the ceiling. He froze. Claire. She followed the light. Shadows. Hundreds of them. Human silhouettes stretched across the ceiling despite there being no light source capable of casting them. Some appeared seated. Others stood. One seemed to lean over another as if whispering. None matched Rowan or Claire. Then, one shadow slowly lifted its head. Claire gasped. The silhouette looked directly down at them. Impossible. It had no face. Yet both of them instinctively knew it was watching. The other shadows remained still. Only that one moved. Rowan stepped backward. His own shadow shifted with him across the floor. The figure on the ceiling did not. Instead, it stood. Without a sound, the dark silhouette began walking across the ceiling toward them. Claire grabbed Rowan's arm. Tell me that's our light. It isn't. Another shadow rose. Then another. One after another, silent black figures peeled themselves away from the ceiling as though separating from dried paint. Yet the room itself remained empty. Nothing occupied the spaces beneath them. Only the shadows moved. The temperature dropped sharply. Their breath fogged the air. The first shadow reached the edge of the ceiling directly above Rowan. It stopped. Its outline twitched unnaturally. Then, with horrifying slowness, it began climbing down the wall without anything casting it. Chapter 2. The shadow reached the floor without making a sound. It did not climb in the way a living creature would. It simply flowed downward, maintaining the shape of a man while ignoring gravity entirely. The black silhouette stretched across the rusted steel until it stood only a few feet from Rowan, darker than the darkness around it. His flashlight shone directly through it. The beam continued across the floor beyond, but wherever the light touched the figure, it seemed to lose its strength, fading into a dull gray as though the shadow consumed its brightness. Claire took an involuntary step backward. The movement echoed through the dining hall. The shadow copied her. Not immediately. Exactly 3 seconds later, it stepped back with the same foot, bent its shoulders at the same angle, turned its head with the same hesitant motion. Rowan noticed another detail. It isn't following us, he whispered. Claire kept her eyes fixed on the figure. What do you mean? It isn't copying us. 3 seconds later, the shadow opened its mouth. No sound came out. Then another shadow detached itself from the ceiling. It repeated Rowan's posture. A third mirrored Claire. Within seconds, nearly a dozen living silhouettes had descended from the overhead steel, each one replaying movements the two explorers had made since entering the room. Like memories, not reflections, the remaining shadows stayed frozen overhead, watching. A deep metallic groan rolled through the ship. Every shadow stopped moving at once. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the dripping water had ceased. Then came a single whisper. Not from the darkness. From somewhere inside the walls. Don't let them finish. Claire's eyes widened. You heard that? Rowan nodded slowly. The voice had been calm. Human. Terrified. Another whisper followed from the opposite side of the room. They become you. The shadows turned together toward the voice. Instantly, they rushed. They did not run. They slid across the floor with impossible speed, merging into one another until they became a single tide of darkness that vanished beneath a row of collapsed cabinets. The room fell still again. Neither Rowan nor Claire moved. Finally Claire spoke. "I think we should leave." Rowan looked toward the corridor. "I was about to suggest the same thing." They retraced their steps. Or tried to. After less than a minute Rowan frowned. "This isn't right." The corridor had changed. The children's cabin should have appeared on the left. Instead they found a narrow passage lined with closed doors, each painted the same faded navy blue. There had been no blue doors before. Claire checked the digital map on her tablet. The screen displayed nothing except a blinking position marker surrounded by empty gray. "No signal? It doesn't even think we're inside the ship." Rowan tested another door. Locked. The second. Locked. The third opened inward with a slow creak. It revealed a bedroom untouched by time. The wallpaper was dry. A bedside lamp stood upright beside an untouched book. A grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner. Tick, tick, tick. Everything inside looked as though someone had walked out moments ago. Except for the window. Beyond it was not the sea. Beyond it stretched a dense pine forest beneath an overcast sky. Claire stared. "That's impossible." Rowan approached carefully. The trees moved gently in the wind. Leaves drifted across the glass. One landed against it with a soft tap. He reached toward the window. Before his fingers touched the pane, a shadow passed between the trees. Then another. Human shapes. Walking silently through the forest. None cast by anything. Claire grabbed his sleeve. "Close the door." He didn't argue. The moment the latch clicked shut, the ticking stopped. The corridor outside had changed again. Now water covered the floor to ankle height. Cold enough to sting through their boots. Rowan swept his flashlight across the surface. Ripples moved toward them. Neither of them had stepped. Something beneath the water had. A long black shape drifted just below the surface. Too large to be human. It passed between them without touching either one. The water remained perfectly still behind it. Claire whispered, "Tell me that's debris." "It isn't." The shape disappeared beneath the opposite wall. Then the wall itself rippled. Not physically. Its shadow did. The darkness along the steel bulged outward before flattening again. Like something breathing beneath skin. The whisper returned. Closer this time. "They're awake." Another voice answered from farther down the passage. "They know you're light." The corridor lights flickered. Rowan hadn't noticed them before. Old brass fixtures lined the ceiling every 10 feet, each glowing with a weak yellow flame despite the ship having no power. One light went out. Darkness swallowed that section of corridor. Immediately a shadow detached itself from the ceiling. Another lamp died farther ahead. Another shadow climbed down. Then another light. Another figure. The darkness spread toward them one lamp at a time. Each extinguished light released another moving silhouette. "There!" Claire shouted. She pointed toward a steel hatch marked engine room. Warm light spilled through the narrow opening beneath the door. Real light, not the sickly yellow glow filling the corridor. Rowan grabbed the wheel handle. It resisted. Together they forced it open. The door slammed shut behind them the instant they entered. The engine room was enormous. Far larger than the ship should have been capable of containing. Towering engines rose several stories high, coated in rust yet vibrating faintly as though still alive. Massive pistons moved with slow mechanical precision. Steam hissed through cracked pipes. The air smelled of hot oil instead of seawater. Claire stared upward. "That's impossible. This ship hasn't had power for 90 years. It shouldn't have engines running at all." A lantern burned beside an old workbench. Freshly trimmed. Someone had lit it recently. Beside it rested a leather-bound logbook. Rowan opened it. The pages were dry. The final entries had been written in neat black ink. October 18, 1934. The passengers noticed first. Their shadows began arriving before they did. We believed it was exhaustion. October 19th. The shadows no longer match their owners. Crew instructed to avoid direct lantern light. October 20th. 3 sailors disappeared after chasing their own silhouettes into cargo hold 2. Their shadows returned alone. October 21st Street. Captain ordered every mirror thrown overboard. They continued appearing anyway. The final page contained only one sentence. If your shadow looks at you before you look at it, the ship has already chosen. Claire slowly lowered her flashlight. Rowan, his stomach tightened. My shadow. It wasn't beside him anymore. He turned. The lantern on the bench cast his silhouette across the steel floor. Except it wasn't copying him. It stood facing the opposite direction. Slowly, very slowly, his shadow raised one hand and waved at him. The lantern flame suddenly shrank to a thin blue thread. Behind Rowan, hundreds of silent footsteps echoed through the engine room as something far larger than a human shadow began descending from the ceiling. Chapter 3. The footsteps stopped all at once. Silence settled over the engine room so completely that Rowan could hear the blood pounding in his ears. The great engines, which moments before had throbbed with impossible life, slowed until the pistons barely moved. Steam drifted through the air in pale ribbons before freezing in place, suspended like strands of glass. Claire did not move. Neither did Rowan. Only their shadows continued to shift across the steel floor. Rowan's shadow lowered its hand. Then it took a single step away from him. It should have been impossible. The lantern still stood on the workbench, its blue flame unmoving. Every law of light dictated that his shadow should remain fixed. Instead, it walked. Claire's shadow followed. The 2 silhouettes crossed the engine room together before stopping beneath the enormous crankshaft suspended high above them. The darkness hanging from the ceiling began to descend. It was not a single shadow. It was thousands. Layer upon layer of overlapping silhouettes flowed downward like ink spilling through water. Faces emerged for an instant before dissolving into others. Sailors. Children, elderly passengers, crewmen in oil-stained overalls. Every figure flattened into darkness, yet each retained just enough shape to suggest a life that had once existed. The whisper came from everywhere at once. They looked back. Another answered. So they stayed. The sea roared overhead, not outside the wreck, above the ceiling, as though the entire Atlantic hung suspended over the engine room. Claire grabbed Rowan's arm. We have to get out. He nodded, but every exit had vanished. The hatch through which they had entered was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of riveted steel. The only opening left was a narrow staircase spiraling upward between the engines, disappearing into darkness. Their shadows were already climbing it. Without speaking, Rowan and Claire followed. The stairs groaned beneath their weight. With every level they climbed, the air grew colder. Salt coated the handrails. Water dripped from somewhere unseen, though none of it reached the steps. Halfway up, Rowan looked over the railing. The engine room had disappeared. Instead of machinery, an endless black sea stretched beneath them. Moonlight shimmered across perfectly still water, though neither moon nor sky could be seen. The staircase no longer belonged inside a ship. It rose through open darkness. Don't look down, Claire whispered. He didn't answer. Ahead, their shadows reached the top and disappeared through a doorway. Rowan pushed it open. He found himself standing on the main deck. The fog had lifted. Night had fallen. The wreck floated alone upon a perfectly calm ocean. There were no cliffs, no shoreline, no inflatable boat, nothing but black water in every direction. The ship had left the coast. A ship's bell rang once. Its sound rolled across the sea for miles before fading into silence. Lanterns burst into life along the deck one after another, bathing the wreck in a warm amber glow. Figures appeared. Passengers walked quietly along the railings, dressed in clothing from another century. Mothers held children's hands. Elderly couples stood gazing over the water. Sailors crossed the deck carrying coils of rope. None of them made a sound. None of them had faces. Only smooth, featureless skin where eyes and mouths should have been. Their shadows, however, their shadows smiled. The silhouettes moved independently beneath the lantern light, speaking to one another with silent gestures while the motionless bodies wandered aimlessly above them. Claire's breathing became ragged. They're backwards. Rowan understood. The bodies were no longer alive. The shadows were. A figure approached from the bow. Unlike the others, he still possessed a face. A weathered naval coat hung neatly over broad shoulders. Salt whitened his beard, and his pale eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had gone without sleep for decades. "The captain," Rowan said quietly. The old man stopped several feet away. "I tried to sink her," he said, his voice calm. "Fire. Explosives. Scuttling charges. Nothing worked." "What happened here?" Rowan asked. The captain looked toward the sea. "We rescued something." The lanterns flickered. "It wasn't a person. We found it drifting after the storm. A man alone on a lifeboat with no name, no papers, no shadow." Claire frowned. "He survived?" "No." The captain's expression darkened. "He never lived." The sea behind him began to ripple. "We brought him aboard because we pitied him." His voice trembled for the first time. "That night every shadow on the ship moved while we slept. The faceless passengers stopped walking. Every body turned toward Rowan and Claire. Only their shadows continued moving. They learned us," the captain continued. "Every fear, every memory, every habit." They waited until someone looked directly at them. Rowan remembered the logbook. "If your shadow looks at you before you look at it, the ship has already chosen," he finished. The captain nodded. "My crew tried to flee. The bodies escaped." He looked around the silent deck. The shadows remained. The sea erupted. A tower of black water rose beside the ship, impossibly tall, blotting out the stars. Within it drifted countless human silhouettes, all slowly turning toward the deck. The captain closed his eyes. "It has come for the last two." Claire suddenly gasped. Her shadow was gone. She spun around. It stood several feet behind her, waiting. Then it stepped forward. Claire screamed as the silhouette pressed itself against her feet. Darkness climbed her legs like spilled ink, racing beneath her clothes. She collapsed to her knees, desperately clawing at herself. Rowan lunged toward her. His own shadow caught his wrist. It felt solid, cold, stronger than flesh. "You can't save her," the captain said quietly. Rowan struggled, but the grip tightened. Claire slowly stood. She faced him. Her face remained her own. Her shadow did not. It stretched outward, towering twice her height before peeling itself away completely. Claire remained standing. Then she crumbled. Not into blood, not into bone, into fine gray dust that scattered across the deck before the wind carried it into the sea. Rowan stared in horror. His shadow stepped closer. For the first time in his life, it spoke. Not aloud. Inside his mind. "You've been following me since the day you were born." The memories came flooding back. Every childhood nightmare where figures stood in impossible corners. Every moment he had caught movement from the corner of his eye. Every photograph where the lighting had never quite matched his silhouette. It had always been ahead of him. Waiting. Learning. The captain removed his hat. "I'm sorry." The faceless passengers began walking again. One by one they stepped over the railings into the sea. Their bodies vanished beneath the black water. Their shadows remained on deck. Hundreds of them, then thousands. They surrounded Rowan without making a sound. His own shadow released his wrist. It faced him, extended a hand. He understood. There was no fighting, no escaping. The wreck had never trapped bodies. It trapped shadows. Everything else eventually found its way home. Rowan looked once toward the empty horizon. Then he took the offered hand. The deck disappeared beneath him. Cold rushed through every nerve as his body dissolved into darkness. For one impossible instant he saw the truth. The haunted shipwreck was not drifting across the ocean. It was drifting through every place where light met darkness. Every shadow cast anywhere in the world touched it for the briefest fraction of a second. Most slipped away unnoticed. Some did not. Morning arrived quietly along the coast. Fishermen found Rowan's inflatable boat drifting near Blackwater Point. Inside lay 2 cameras. The memory cards contained hundreds of photographs. Every image showed the abandoned wreck exactly as expected. Empty decks, collapsed corridors, rusted engines. There was no sign Rowan or Claire had ever boarded. Until investigators reached the final photograph. It showed the ship from several hundred feet offshore. Nothing appeared unusual at first. Then someone noticed the sunlight. The morning sun shone from the east. Every shadow on the ship pointed west. Except one. Near the bow stood the shadow of a man wearing a diving helmet. There was no body attached to it. Over the following months, sailors reported seeing a lone diver standing on the deck whenever dense fog surrounded the wreck. He never waved. He never moved. Only his shadow did. Sometimes, just before the fog swallowed the ship completely, it would step away from him and wait at the rail for the next visitor. For more stories, like and subscribe.